The wind has changed over London. Soft now, but strange, as if it carries a secret no one dares speak aloud. Somewhere behind a rain-dappled window, a violin plays not for triumph, but for something left unresolved. In this city of polished boots and hidden motives, a name unspoken may weigh more than 1,000 crimes confessed. Tonight, our story takes us through a case that begins with silence and ends with something far more unsettling. A shadow falls across Baker Street, not cast by the criminal, but by the truth itself, and in that shadow, Sherlock Holmes faces a decision that no logic can cleanly answer. Before the mystery unfolds, I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from this evening? And what hour marks your part of the night? Share it with us in the comments. Now then, the fog has lifted, the fire is low, and not all crimes beg to be solved. Come closer and let the story begin. It was one of those grey mornings in early March when London lay muffled beneath a thin veil of fog. The air hung motionless beyond the windows of Baker Street, and the slow ticking of the clock was the only sound in our sitting room. Holmes, wrapped in his dressing gown, sat before the fire, his long fingers steepled, his gaze fixed upon the curling smoke from his pipe. For my part, I had been occupied with the morning paper, which offered nothing of note beyond the usual crimes and scandals of the city. It was, in short, a morning of rare tranquillity, until a sudden, violent knock broke upon the door, startling even my imperturbable companion. Mrs. Hudson's hurried footsteps echoed up the stair, followed by the sound of a foreign voice, breathless and imploring. Holmes's eyes brightened with that peculiar glint which heralded the advent of a new enigma. "You will forgive the interruption, Watson," he murmured, rising. "The game, I fancy, has begun once more." Our visitor was a man of distinguished bearing, yet his trembling hands betrayed a mind shaken to its depths. His face, pale beneath a trim beard, was that of one accustomed to command, but the eyes, dark, restless, and filled with dread, told a very different story. "My name," he said with a nervous accent tinged by the continent, "is Baron Victor Kral of Prague. I have come to you, Mr. Holmes, for protection from something that follows me across borders, across nights." He clasped his gloved hands together as though to steady himself. "A shadow, gentlemen, a shadow from Prague." I saw Holmes's brows lift ever so slightly, but he did not interrupt. The man's words trembled with sincerity. His refinement only heightened the oddity of his terror. "Every port, every inn, I have felt its presence, once in Vienna, once in Calais, and last night here, in London." He glanced toward the curtained window, his breath catching. "It does not rest." The fire crackled faintly. Holmes motioned for him to continue. "Tell us all," he said. "Let us see what form your shadow takes." The Baron drew from his coat a handkerchief and passed it across his brow. "There was another," he began. "A friend, no, a confidant, who travelled with me from Prague. 2 weeks past, he was found dead in his chamber at Dresden. The doctors called it apoplexy, but his hands were clenched about a scrap of red wax. Wax of the kind used to seal a letter bearing my own crest." His voice faltered. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a crumpled note. "This I received the following morning. No words, only a symbol pressed into the wax. The old Bohemian double lion." Holmes's eyes flickered toward me. He knew the emblem well. "From that moment," the Baron went on, "I have heard footsteps near my lodgings, soft as the turning of a page. Once, a shadow against the curtain. Then nothing." His narrative broke into fragments, fear contorting each sentence into confession. "You must believe me, Mr. Holmes," he whispered hoarsely. "It is not madness. Something, waits." He pressed his fist to his temples as though to drive away the image. Holmes's silence was complete, but I saw the quick, analytical gleam in his eyes. Throughout the Baron's halting recital, Holmes had remained as still as the carved figure of a saint, his face half in shadow, his gaze unbroken. When the man paused, Holmes rose and passed quietly behind him, as though drawn by some unseen thread. "You have travelled far, Baron," he said at last, "and not without difficulty." The statement, spoken softly, startled our visitor. "You are observant, sir," he stammered. Holmes merely inclined his head. I, too, had noted the details that marked him, the faint scent of wax that clung to his sleeve, a slight tremor of the left hand, a burn mark upon one glove, as if singed by candle flame. Holmes took up a scrap of paper from the mantel and scribbled a few symbols upon it, folding it neatly before slipping it into his pocket. "You do well to come to me," he said. "Fear is a poor companion for reason." The Baron looked bewildered. Holmes did not elaborate, and I saw in his expression that he had already discerned more than he wished to reveal. The Baron hesitated, then drew from his breast pocket an envelope, yellowed at the edges, its flap unbroken and sealed with the scarlet impression of the Bohemian crest. "This was found beneath my door this morning," he said. "I have not dared to open it." Holmes received it between his long fingers, holding it delicately to the light. "A fine wax," he remarked. "Imperial, not commercial, and fresh within the day." He turned it over several times, then pressed the seal lightly against his thumb. "You are wise to refrain, Baron. Some doors, once entered, cannot easily be closed again." He laid the letter on the table and stepped back, his eyes gleaming. "You will leave it with me." The Baron's relief was palpable. "You think, then, that I am in danger?" Holmes's tone was grave. "I think," he said, "that you have already crossed the threshold of it." The words seemed to strike him like a blow. He lowered his gaze, murmuring something inaudible, and clutched his gloves tightly in his hands. For a moment, silence enveloped the room, broken only by the faint hiss of the fire. The Baron's composure began to crumble. "You will help me, Mr. Holmes," he pleaded. Holmes regarded him with calm intensity. "I shall do what reason and truth permit," he said. Then, leaning forward, his voice dropped to a tone almost of pity. "But tell me, Baron, was it truly an accident?" The man froze. His lips parted, but no sound escaped. The colour drained from his face, leaving him ashen. I do not understand," he stammered in confusion. Holmes said nothing further. Rising abruptly, the Baron muttered a phrase in Czech, a prayer, perhaps, or a curse, and made for the door. The echo of his hurried steps lingered in the passage long after he was gone. I turned to Holmes, perplexed. He had resumed his seat, his eyes fixed upon the sealed envelope as though it might yet speak. I could restrain myself no longer. "Holmes," I said, "what did you mean by that question? What accident?" He did not reply at once. Instead, he rose, drew aside the curtain, and gazed out into the white obscurity that enveloped Baker Street. The fog swirled against the panes like restless smoke. "There are currents, my dear Watson," he said at last, "that run deeper than the Thames. Our visitor carries with him the scent of one of them." He tapped the glass lightly with his finger. "The Vltava runs deep, and some rivers carry what they should not." I confess I did not understand him, but there was that in his tone which stilled all further questioning. He returned to his chair, the faintest smile playing upon his lips. "Let us wait," he said. "The shadow that follows him will not long remain content to walk unseen." And with that enigmatic remark, he turned once more to his pipe, lost in his own unfathomable reflections. The Baron's lodgings, situated in a quiet crescent off Marylebone Road, bore the understated elegance of a man who had once known grandeur, but now clung to refinement with fading hands. The room into which we were shown held no ostentation, but there were curious details which caught the attentive eye. An ivory letter-opener shaped like a falcon rested atop a Bohemian volume of verse, its pages well thumbed. A velvet curtain, slightly torn, had been hurriedly stitched. The heavy air within was tinged by the faintest aroma, a blend of pipe tobacco and the sharper tang of candle wax long since extinguished. A half-burned incense cone of Eastern origin smouldered in a ceramic bowl, and above the mantel hung a portrait of a woman, her expression serene, her eyes somehow distant. Holmes's gaze lingered upon the frame, but did not linger upon the face. The Baron, who had preceded us into the room, spoke little and gestured feebly to his possessions. Holmes moved slowly, almost reverently, into the space, his fingers drawn toward the shadows where the domestic and the clandestine often converged. Holmes stepped soundlessly to the writing desk. Though polished and orderly at first glance, it bore the subtle hallmarks of recent and hasty disturbance. A drawer, misaligned by a fraction, refused to close smoothly. Within, scattered correspondence had been shuffled without thought. Several envelopes half torn, others unopened. A ledger in check script, partially soaked along the spine, had a corner stiffened with dried wax. Holmes ran a fingertip along the grain of the desk and paused where the faintest outline of a circle had been impressed, as from a seal pressed in urgency. At the casement window, Holmes examined the latch and drew in his breath almost imperceptibly. There, near the hook, was a minute smear of yellowish wax, so faint it would escape any casual glance. "Not the postman," he murmured, "and not the Baron himself, who uses a desk seal." I joined him at the sill and looked out into the narrow courtyard, but the fog offered nothing in return. The Baron, silent in the doorway, seemed not to notice the scrutiny, or perhaps had learned the art of practiced detachment. Holmes continued, with the expression of a man assembling the first edge pieces of a darker puzzle. It was Holmes who discovered the violin case, tucked behind the curtain near the fireplace. It was of fine make, the leather worn but well kept, except for the long diagonal crack across its top, a fracture as though made by deliberate force. Holmes knelt and drew the case into the light. The interior was empty, save for a folded scrap of aged music paper wedged into the lining. He unfolded it delicately, revealing a torn section of notation. The staff lines were erratic, and though some notes had been penciled in, others were replaced by small annotated letters and numbers. Holmes held it between his fingers and brought it close to the lamp. "Curious," he muttered. "This is no mere melody. It is an encryption." I leaned forward. "A cipher?" Holmes nodded absently. "One written by someone familiar with both music and code." The Baron stirred. "It is nothing," he said hastily. "Just a fragment from Prague. I had forgotten it remained." But Holmes's eyes had not moved from the page. "One does not forget such things, Baron, not when they are carried across borders." He folded the sheet once more, slid it into his pocket, and turned toward the man with newfound intensity. The Baron, upon Holmes's quiet insistence, reluctantly took the armchair by the fire. He drew his coat tighter about him, though the room was warm. "You said it was only a fragment," Holmes began, in a voice neither accusing nor gentle. "But this cipher was created by someone with considerable skill. What purpose did it serve?" The Baron's gaze flitted to the hearth and back again. "I am not a cryptographer, Mr. Holmes." "Yet you carried it here. In a broken case. Why not discard it?" His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his cuff. "Some things one does not destroy, even if they no longer serve us." There was a silence that stretched too long. I observed the man's face, not simply drawn by fear, but shaped by some inner weight, as though memory itself had grown sharp with time. Holmes asked no further question. He merely returned to the desk and made a final notation in his pocketbook. The Baron did not meet his eyes again. The fragment of music, for now, had spoken all it would, and perhaps more than the man intended. Back at Baker Street that afternoon, Holmes placed the torn music fragment beneath the lens of his small microscope, the gaslight casting a pale reflection on the paper's faded ink. "It is fortunate," he remarked, "that our man lacks the hand of a true composer. The irregular spacing, the misplaced rests. These are no errors of art, but deliberate aberrations." I watched as he transcribed several notes into letters, then into numerals. "The cipher is a simple substitution," he explained. The penciled markings refer to a series of intervals, fifths, sevenths, aligning with letters based on a fixed scale. He stepped back. Observe, K-R-A-L, the Baron's own name, followed by a date, May 12th. Is that the date of the message, or its subject? I asked. Holmes offered a thin smile. Ah, Watson, that is the very thing. One cannot compose a question in cipher unless one knows the music behind it. He placed the slip in his desk drawer and closed it with care. The Prague Conservatory, he added, almost to himself. Let us hope they have not played their final movement. The implications of that phrase, at the time, escaped me. In retrospect, they chill me still. It was near 8 o'clock that evening when Holmes, after a long period of silent reflection, bade me accompany him to the Baron's lodgings once more. There is something unfinished, he said simply. And unfinished things attract attention in London, as in Prague. We found the landlady distressed upon our arrival. He's been attacked, sir, she whispered. I heard a scuffle and ran for the constable, but whoever it was, they vanished before I returned. Holmes bounded up the stairs 2 at a time, and I followed to find the Baron seated heavily on his bed, his face pale, one hand wrapped in a bloodied cloth. The window stood open, fog curling in from the street below. Holmes inspected the sill and gestured toward the iron railing beyond. A smear of soft yellow wax clung to its edge, faint but fresh. On the floor near the door lay a small silver coin. Holmes stooped, lifted it, and held it to the light. A koruna, he said quietly. From Prague. The Baron said nothing. His breath came short and shallow. In that silence, something had shifted. The fear was no longer anticipatory. It had arrived, and it had touched him. Holmes knelt before the Baron, his voice low and composed. Your attacker left no weapon, no note. He left something rarer, restraint. Whoever visited you tonight wished not to kill but to remind. The Baron, eyes fixed on some distant point, gave no reply. Holmes took his wounded hand and examined it gently. A shallow cut, he said. Deliberate. The Baron's lips moved at last. He was tall, wore gloves, and he said nothing. Holmes nodded. Silence can speak volumes when the right man delivers it. As we made our way back to Baker Street, I ventured to ask what he made of the encounter. It was a warning, he said. A message carried not in ink but in wax, steel and silver. I pressed him further. Do you believe this is still a matter of political intrigue? He gave a rare sigh. Music, my dear Watson, is not the only thing that travels from Prague to London. There are men who move like compositions, written in one city, performed in another, with only the final note in sight. And with that, he fell silent. But I could not escape the feeling that something had begun which neither of us yet fully understood. It was not the sun that woke me, but the sharp rattle of the bell and the unmistakable sound of Holmes's tread in the passage outside my chamber. I rose at once to find him already dressed, a telegram unfolded in his hand, and a thin smile playing upon his lips. Our Bohemian mystery continues, Watson, he said. Baron Kral is dead. I must confess the words struck me like a blow. Dead? How? He passed me the slip, where Inspector Lestrade's economical hand delivered its terse report. Body recovered at Limehouse Dock. Suspected suicide. Request presence immediately. Within the hour, we were in a hansom, hurtling eastward through the pale morning light. Holmes's silence was deep, but not idle. His fingers tapped a nervous rhythm upon his thigh, not of doubt, but of consideration. I had hoped, he said at last, to forestall the final note. It seems the composition has chosen its own conclusion. We said little else on the journey, but I could not shake the feeling that what awaited us by the river would be no ordinary drowning. Limehouse, at that hour, was still half asleep, shrouded in a thick curtain of mist that rose from the river like the breath of some ancient leviathan. The great ships, moored in silence, loomed like ghosts above the oily water. A mournful horn wailed in the distance, and the cries of gulls fell away into muffled echoes. We made our way through narrow lanes where brick gave way to timber, and the air was pungent with salt, damp rope, and fish long past its prime. At the edge of a narrow wharf, a small crowd had gathered, mostly dockhands and constables. Their faces were marked less by horror than by resignation, men accustomed to the river's cold gifts. Inspector Lestrade stood among them, his coat buttoned to the chin, his moustache streaked with dew. He nodded to Holmes without preamble and motioned toward the edge. "There," he said. "Pulled him out not half an hour ago. Identification confirmed by the landlady. Baron Victor Kral." Holmes said nothing but stepped forward. I followed, reluctant but compelled. The mist thickened around us, as though wishing to conceal what lay beneath. The Baron lay sprawled upon the damp timbers, his limbs twisted not in agony, but in repose, as though sleep had overtaken him mid-thought. His hair, once carefully groomed, clung to his brow in dark strands. Water dripped steadily from the hem of his coat and pooled beneath his shoulders. It was the feet that drew Holmes's notice first. The Baron's boots, though clearly of fine foreign make, bore not a trace of mud or river silt. Holmes crouched beside the body, lifting one sodden sleeve and frowning. "Too clean," he murmured, "even for a fall from the embankment." Then delicately, he rolled the right wrist to expose the underside. I caught my breath. A thin violin string had been wound tightly about the wrist, cutting deep into the flesh. It had not been tied in haste. The knot was precise, the pressure calculated. Holmes examined the ligature without comment, then glanced at the man's other hand. The fingertips were pink, but bore no damage, no sign of resistance. He reached into his coat and retrieved his lens. Lestrade peered over his shoulder. "Looks like he tied it himself," he offered. Holmes did not reply, but I noted the faint narrowing of his eyes. "Suicide, you say?" Holmes remarked at length, rising to his full height and brushing the moisture from his knees. "And how did he come to drown so cleanly, Inspector? His boots are dry inside, his fingernails unbroken. Yet his wrist is bound by a string no sane man would keep about him, let alone use to end his life." Lestrade sniffed, clearly bristling. "Well, I never said he meant to drown. Could have been madness. Foreign types, you know. We've seen worse." Holmes turned away from the body and faced him fully. "Madness leaves traces, Lestrade. This," he gestured to the corpse, "this was composed." The inspector frowned. "You suggest murder." "I suggest," Holmes said coolly, "that the details here are not those of a man in despair, but of a message carefully written." He requested that the Baron's possessions be collected and secured, particularly any papers from his rooms. Lestrade assented with a grunt, but I sensed the old friction between them. Holmes turned back to the water, where the fog still clung like a curtain drawn before some unspoken truth. "Tell me," he murmured, "do men in despair tie strings around their own pulse?" We returned briefly to a nearby station house where Holmes was permitted the use of a small office. There, under the flickering gaslight, he laid the violin string across a sheet of blotting paper and examined it through his lens. "What do you see?" I asked softly. He did not look up. "Wax, the same pale variety we observed on the window latch at the Baron's lodgings, and here." He pointed to a thin discoloration, a trace of burnt oil, likely from a candle wick. The knot was tied under artificial light. He turned the string delicately in his hands. Whoever did this worked with great care. They did not wish the string to cut too deeply, only enough to draw the eye. "And look." He held the end toward me. "It has been played. See the faint rosin marks. This string belonged not to a coil, but to a violin, and one recently in use." "A message, then," I said. Holmes gave a slow nod. "An elegy, perhaps, or a signature." He pocketed the evidence and drew on his gloves. "Come, Watson. The music has begun. but we have yet to find the hand that composed it. The air outside had grown no lighter, the fog pressing low over the wharves like a weary hand. Holmes walked with his hands clasped behind his back, his pace unhurried, his eyes scanning the surroundings, not for a person, but for pattern. I found myself trailing a pace behind, unnerved by the quiet and by the way strangers seemed to emerge and vanish into the gloom without sound. The faces we passed were swarthy, unsmiling, sailors of many tongues, merchants wrapped in shawls, errand boys too pale for the hour. There was a tension in the air I could not name, like a melody waiting to resolve its final chord. At one point, a long, low whistle echoed through an alley, and Holmes paused, but said nothing. When I ventured to speak, he held up a hand. "Not yet," he said. "There are too many ears here not listening, and too many eyes not watching." And with that cryptic remark, we pressed on, deeper into the quarter where London keeps its quietest secrets. At last, Holmes turned toward the river one final time before we hailed a cab. The fog had thinned, but not lifted, and a steady hush lingered over Limehouse like the held breath of a secret not quite spoken. I studied his face, distant, unreadable, with that peculiar stillness which often followed his most disquieting insights. "He was silenced," I said, before he could speak. "Perhaps," Holmes replied, "or perhaps he had already said too much." As the cab rattled away from the dock, he added, almost absently, "A man does not tie his own elegy about his pulse, Watson. Someone else composed the final bars." I shivered despite myself. Though no blade had been drawn, no pistol fired, I could not shake the certainty that we had stood at the very edge of something calculated, something unfinished. And somewhere I was. Convinced, the true author of the Baron's fate still walked, cloaked not in fog, but in purpose. Holmes said no more, and I dared not ask. The morning broke grey and listless, with a thin drizzle that blurred the edges of London's facades. Our cab rolled steadily southward through streets still half asleep, the rattle of its wheels muffled by the wet. Holmes sat opposite me, his chin resting upon his clasped hands, his eyes fixed upon some invisible horizon of thought. I knew that look well, the stillness of a mind engaged in ruthless calculation. Neither of us spoke as we passed from the narrow lanes of Marylebone into the broad avenues of Belgravia, where foreign embassies stood like fortresses of secrecy amid the fog. Holmes's expression betrayed no emotion, yet I detected in him a restrained energy, the same tension that had preceded our visit to Stoke Moran years before. At last, as the carriage drew up to the tall iron gates of the Bohemian embassy, he spoke almost absently. A dead man, a cipher in music, and a violin string for his requiem. Do you not find, Watson, that diplomacy often plays its most dangerous tunes in the minor key? Before I could reply, the footman appeared at the step, and Holmes was already descending into the cold mist of foreign intrigue. We were ushered into a high-ceilinged chamber draped in heavy crimson fabric. The scent of burning cedar mingled with that of old paper and perfume. There, beneath a portrait of a stern-faced diplomat, stood Countess Eliska Novakova, a woman of striking composure, though the black silk of her mourning gown softened her authority. She greeted us with measured politeness, her accent lilting faintly on each word. "It grieves me deeply, gentlemen," she said, "to hear of Baron Kral's tragic death. He was a man of influence." Her voice wavered only slightly. Holmes inclined his head. "And of secrets, no doubt, madam." The Countess did not answer immediately. "In diplomacy," she said at last, "we all keep secrets, even from ourselves." It was not until Holmes mentioned the broken violin case that her calm fractured. Her eyes darted, if only for a second, toward the embers in the grate, where a trace of wax gleamed faintly on the andiron. "An old possession," she murmured. "The Baron loved music. It was his only solace." Holmes's reply was soft but deliberate. "And yet, Countess, it appears that music has followed him, even into death." Her composure returned, but I sensed her mourning was not entirely for the dead. As she rose to pour tea, Holmes's gaze followed the delicate motion of her gloved hands. They were faultless in their elegance, save for one subtle imperfection. The right glove bore a small, dark scorch upon its fingertip. "A misadventure with a candle, perhaps?" Holmes inquired lightly. The Countess froze, her eyes flickering momentarily to the hearth. "An old burn," she said quickly, "from sealing correspondence." Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah, diplomatic seals. The truest art of silence." At this, her hand trembled slightly. "I do not concern myself with such things since my husband's passing," she replied, too swiftly to be convincing. "The clerks manage all matters of correspondence now." Holmes reached for his hat. "Naturally," he said, "and yet I must commend the skill of your staff. The embassies of Europe are seldom so—" He paused, his eyes fixed on her tightened grip, efficient. She did not reply, but her knuckles whitened beneath the kid leather. As we were shown out, Holmes whispered under his breath, "When a lady grips her gloves so tightly, Watson, it is seldom the chill that compels her." The faint scent of wax lingered on the air behind us as we stepped once more into the fog. The Countess's manner had been gracious to a fault, but there was an unmistakable tension in the atmosphere of that embassy. A sense of conversations half spoken and gazes half averted. Holmes paused before the great staircase, as though struck by an afterthought. "One question more, madam," he said, turning back to her. "Did the Baron ever send correspondence through this office in the past week?" Her lips curved faintly. "If he did, Mr. Holmes, it was in his own hand. We act as hosts, not messengers." Holmes's eyes strayed to a writing desk near the window. Upon it stood a silver taper holder, its wax drippings freshly hardened. "A curious distinction," he murmured. The Countess's eyes followed his glance. "You are observant, sir," she said coldly. "It is both my gift and my affliction," he replied. Her reply was a polite dismissal, yet her gaze lingered uneasily on the desk. Holmes bowed and withdrew. I saw, as the door closed behind us, that she exhaled in visible relief. "Watson," he whispered, "that desk holds our overture, but it would be unseemly to play the next note in the presence of an audience." And so we stepped once more into the London fog, our cue not yet complete. We had scarcely reached the carriage before Holmes turned sharply. "A moment more, Watson. I have mislaid my cane." Without waiting for protest, he re-entered the embassy, leaving me bewildered on the pavement. When he emerged again some minutes later, his cane was indeed in hand, but the faintest trace of triumph rested in his expression. As the carriage rattled away, I ventured a question. "You recovered it easily enough?" "Quite," he said, removing his gloves. Though in doing so, I was granted an unhurried view of the Countess's study and her correspondence. He withdrew from his coat pocket a folded sheet of embossed paper. "Observe this, Watson, the embassy letterhead. The watermark forms a faint musical stave. The decorative flourishes upon the crest are not mere ornamentation, they are notes." He held it to the light. "A cipher in plain sight, concealed within the ink of officialdom." I examined it in amazement. "And you copied this by memory?" "By habit," he replied simply. "Repetition sharpens both musician and detective." He leaned back with a sigh. "The embassy writes symphonies, Watson. But I fear the next will not be in a major key." That evening, beneath the familiar glow of our Baker Street lamps, Holmes laid out the sheet he had sketched from memory. He set beside it his violin, whose polished surface caught the flicker of the fire. "The cipher," he explained, "is structured upon a diatonic scale. Each emblematic curl corresponds to a note, and each note to a letter." He drew his bow gently across the strings, forming a hesitant melody. "Do you hear it, Watson? A name written in music." I leaned forward as he jotted the letters upon a scrap of paper. E.N. Iliska Novakova, I murmured. Holmes nodded, but did not smile. Too clear, too deliberate. It may not signify guilt, only intention. Still, the tune is too artful to be coincidence. He rose, restless. No amateur diplomat devised this cipher. It speaks of discipline, of a musician's mind, trained and dangerous. He extinguished the lamp above the desk. When letters sing, Watson, they seldom do so without purpose. The question is, who composed the melody and for whose ear? I could find no answer, and the faint sound of Holmes's bow lingered in the darkness long after the fire had sunk to embers. The following morning, as the first light crept through the fogged panes, I found Holmes at the window, his dressing gown wrapped about him and the cipher sheet spread upon his knees. He did not look up as I entered. "You are still pondering the Countess?" I asked. He smiled faintly. Pondering, yes. Accusing, no. Her hand may have written the notes, but I suspect the baton rests elsewhere. I reminded him of her trembling and of the scorch upon her glove. Surely that alone suggests complicity. He turned his gaze to me with that serene patience which always made me feel the schoolboy before the master. My dear Watson, in diplomacy guilt is a question not of conscience but of ink, and who holds the pen. He folded the paper neatly and slipped it into his pocket. Until we know who dictated the tune, we must not assume who played it. He struck a match and lit his pipe. The morning sunlight fell pale and cold upon his features. London, he murmured, has never lacked for shadows, only for men who can read the pattern they make. And once again, the game pressed forward into uncertainty. It was upon one of those evenings peculiar to the London winter, a damp, suffocating fog that crept low along the pavements and rendered even familiar shapes strange, that Holmes grew restless. He had sat for the better part of an hour in his chair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze unblinking and fixed upon the hearth, though the fire had long since reduced itself to a brooding glow. "I believe," he said at length, rising abruptly, "that the air would benefit my reasoning more than these four walls." It was not often Holmes initiated such excursions, especially without a specific objective, and I sensed at once the movement of unease beneath his still exterior. There was in his voice not weariness, but something akin to preoccupation, a question half-formed, pressing against the edges of deduction. Without waiting for my reply, he took up his coat and hat, and I followed him into the thick blanket of mist. The gas lamps gave off a jaundiced glow, and every distant footstep sounded like a whispered secret. We walked in silence, and I knew better than to disturb his thoughts, which moved then, I felt it instinctively, not toward resolution, but toward a shadow. We had just passed through Regent's Park, its gravel walks reduced to vague paths of damp blackness, when Holmes halted abruptly. I drew up beside him. "Listen," he said softly. I strained my ears and caught it. A second rhythm of footsteps, faint, deliberate, matching our own with the precision of a dance. We resumed our pace. The sound continued. Then, through the fog, a figure took shape, tall, cloaked, and walking at a measured distance behind us. The moment we turned to face it, it paused. A moment later, it vanished between the trees. Holmes said nothing, but the tightness at the corners of his mouth betrayed a new tension. We proceeded southward along the outer circle, our footsteps now intentional, baiting. Twice more, the figure appeared, once briefly beneath a street lamp, its shadow flaring across the fog, and again near a stand of bare-limbed elms, before slipping from view once more. "I believe," Holmes murmured at last, "that our unseen companion wishes to be neither wholly absent nor wholly seen. It is not pursuit he offers, Watson, but theatre, and we have accepted our parts." The air seemed to thicken with each step, and still we walked deeper into the silence. Without warning, Holmes turned sharply down a side street, his stride lengthening. I followed, the cold air stinging my throat. A shadow flickered past a boarded shop front, then darted left again through a narrow lane. Holmes increased his pace. The pursuit took us through a web of alleys that grew ever more confounding in the fog. Silent courtyards with no exits, iron staircases slick with dew, and walls that pressed in like the sides of a maze. Each time we thought ourselves gaining, the figure would vanish and reappear, always a few yards ahead, always just beyond our reach. We passed a shuttered bakery, the scent of stale flour lingering, then through an archway into a square I did not recognize. There, in the center, stood a low stone fountain long dry, its edges chipped and weeping moss. The figure darted past it, then was gone. Holmes slowed, his breath short but steady. "This," he said, scanning the fog, "was no flight born of panic. It was a drawing in, a staging, and the final act, I suspect, has not yet played." He turned in a slow circle, listening, but the mist offered no further voice, and the street stood empty, but for our own breath and the echo of footsteps now past. We returned to Baker Street shortly after 10, neither of us having spoken during the cab ride. Holmes, though composed, moved with a sharpness that betrayed agitation. He cast off his coat and made for the fire without delay. I followed more slowly, removing my gloves, when I felt a stiffness along the inside lining of my greatcoat. Reaching into the inner pocket, my fingers closed upon a folded paper, one I had not placed there. I drew it out and unfolded it in silence. Holmes turned, and at the sight of the notations upon the page, his eyes narrowed. It was a scrap of sheet music, but the notes were marked with curious intervals and insertions, identical in style to the fragment we had earlier recovered from the Baron's cracked violin case. Holmes took it from me with care, his fingers brushing the edge with a deliberate slowness. "So," he said quietly, "the fog served more than one purpose tonight." He laid it upon the table beside the firelight. "You were not merely observed, Watson. You were chosen." There was something unsettling in the idea, though I could not yet say why. Holmes, however, already understood its weight. He settled into his chair with the page spread flat before him, the firelight catching the curve of his profile as he leaned in. His eyes moved across the notes, but it was not music he heard. It was language. "You see," he began, "that the first bar mimics the rhythm of the earlier cipher, but with subtle deviations, a shifted interval here, a suspended rest there. These are intentional blemishes, designed to attract the attention of one who has seen the original." He reached for his pencil and drew a faint grid beside the notations. "It is not a warning, nor is it a threat. It is direction." I frowned. "You mean it is meant to lead us somewhere?" Holmes nodded. "More precisely, it was meant to lead me. The paper was not left by the one who hunts, but by one who hopes to be found, or followed. The shadow we glimpsed tonight does not flee us. It beckons." He sat back, fingers steepled. "Curious, is it not? The most dangerous enemies conceal themselves, but those who seek our aid, they emerge, if only long enough to leave a trace." And there, upon my own coat, the trace had been planted. Holmes did not move for some time. At last, he spoke in a tone devoid of triumph. "I have begun to see the outline, Watson, though the figure itself remains obscured." He tapped the edge of the ciphered sheet. "These notes are not merely a summons. They correspond to a key, one linked, I believe, to a document smuggled into this country under the guise of music." "A document?" I echoed. He nodded slowly. "A treaty, one forged in secrecy, concealed within the very symbols that declare its art. The Baron, I now believe, intended to reveal it. That is why he was silenced. The cipher leads to its location, or to its possessor." The notion struck me with cold clarity. "And Radek?" Holmes's gaze darkened. "If Radek lives, and I now suspect he does, then he too seeks it, not to preserve peace, but to prevent its exposure. He turned toward the window, where the fog had begun to thicken once more. What we pursue is no longer a man, Watson. It is a message dressed in melody, and someone will kill to keep it from being heard. Even as Holmes spoke, a faint sound interrupted him, a single, deliberate tap at the window pane. We turned in unison, but the glass was clouded with condensation and mist. Holmes crossed the room swiftly and opened it. Only the night greeted us, formless, silent, unbroken, save for the soft hiss of fog against stone. He stood still for a long moment, listening, then shut the window and drew the curtains closed. "Our visitor," he said softly, "is patient." He looked down at the cipher on the table, its lines stark against the pale paper, and still at large. No further word was spoken that night. Yet the air in our rooms seemed to breathe differently, slower, colder, waiting. It was late in the afternoon when Holmes returned from his solitary excursion, his boots caked with river damp and his collar turned up against the persistent drizzle. Without a word, he placed a small bundle of effects upon the table and withdrew to his armchair with the air of one whose mind was elsewhere entirely. Curious, I drew nearer. Among the Baron's recovered possessions, a monogrammed cigarette case, a Bohemian railway token, a handkerchief faintly scented with myrrh, lay a folded photograph, yellowed at the edges and worn thin along the creases. I opened it carefully. 3 figures posed before an arched window. Baron Kral, unmistakably younger and smiling faintly. Beside him, Countess Eliska Novakova, elegant even in candid light, and to their right, a torn absence. The third figure savagely removed, the tear-cleaving face and shoulder alike. Holmes did not speak, but his eyes had not strayed from the photograph. There was a melancholy quiet about him, as though he stared not merely at what was shown, but at what had once been. "The hand that tore this," he said at last, "meant to erase a man, not from memory, but from history. And yet memory, Watson, is far less compliant than paper." Holmes rose, brought the photograph to the lamp, and took up his lens with the precision of a surgeon preparing to examine a wound. He said nothing for some time, studying the edges of the tear with an almost reverent scrutiny. "This was no act of impulse," he murmured. "The rip is clean along the vertical axis, precise, not ragged. The paper fibers show pressure from both sides, and there is no abrasion to the surviving corners. Whoever did this had a steady hand and a reason to be methodical." He turned it slightly, allowing the gaslight to reveal the fine scoring left by the act. "It is the work of someone not merely erasing an image, but excising a presence, a name, a role, perhaps even a debt." I asked softly. "You believe the third man was the key?" Holmes tapped the blank corner. "Kral's death is a prelude, not a conclusion. This absence speaks louder than any signature." He crossed to the bureau and retrieved a pair of calipers from his drawer. "Fortunately," he added, "not all impressions are so easily destroyed." With that, he returned to the photograph, measuring the proportions of shoulder, elbow, and collar, hunting the ghost of the man the paper could no longer show. It was then that Holmes drew in a sudden breath. "Watson," the wine-glass. I leaned closer. There, upon the small side table behind the central figures, rested a glass of red wine. Unremarkable at first glance. But within the curve of its surface, distorted by the refraction of light and shape, was a ghostly suggestion. A sliver of cheekbone, the arc of a moustache, a military collar faintly outlined in silver braid. Holmes adjusted the angle beneath the lamp and frowned in concentration. The photograph was taken near dusk. Note the angle of the shadows. The reflection belongs not to the Baron or the Countess, but to the man removed. He traced with a pencil the position of the glass, then overlaid a transparency he'd fashioned for just such purposes. Using the known widths of the Baron's shoulder and the Countess's height, he began reconstructing the third figure through geometric inference. "Not a civilian," he muttered. See the stiffness in the bearing. And this. He tapped the faintest glint of an insignia near the reflected collar. That, Watson, is not Bohemian. It is Austrian. The room fell quiet again, but the tension within Holmes had shifted, no longer contemplative, but pointed. Holmes worked into the evening, his violin untouched upon the shelf, his supper left cooling upon the tray. His mind, I could see, was consumed not merely with the image, but with its implications. Shortly after 8, he consulted the Foreign Office Gazetteer and the 1886 Prague Registry, muttering as he scanned column after column of names. At last he paused, then turned the page with slow deliberation. His finger came to rest halfway down the column. Radek, he said. Colonel Emmerich Radek. I recalled the name faintly. A scandal from years past. Was he not disgraced? A failed coup or something of that nature? Precisely, Holmes said. Once decorated by the Austrian crown, later accused of espionage against his own allies. He vanished shortly before his trial in Vienna. Presumed dead, but without body or grave. He returned to the photograph. It was he who stood beside Kral and the Countess. This was no casual acquaintance. This was a triumvirate forged in politics, espionage, and something deeper still. He lit a match and held it near the torn edge of the photo. Not to burn, but to test the paper's grain. 3 stood together in Prague, he murmured. Now 2 remain, one silenced, the other silent. Holmes poured himself a half-glass of Burgundy, though I noted he did not taste it. He held it up to the lamplight, watching the liquid swirl as he spoke. It is a rare thing, Watson, for a ghost to pursue his vengeance with such measured patience. Radek, if indeed he lives, has waited nearly 5 years, not for opportunity, but for reckoning. I asked, You believe Kroll betrayed him? Holmes nodded slowly. And not merely by silence. Consider, Radek vanishes on the eve of a military scandal. Kral rises in diplomatic circles. A cipher appears within a violin case, a coded message wrapped in music, and the last surviving man dies not in battle or confession, but in silence, bound by the very instrument that once sang his secrets. There was a kind of dread in Holmes's voice then, not of danger, but of recognition. Radek has not returned to destroy nations or treaties. He has returned to erase a name. But whose? He turned back to the envelope that held the photograph. One man is dead, another hides behind mourning veils, and the third, Watson. He did not finish. The sentence, like the shadow he pursued, drifted unresolved into the evening's stillness. Holmes tapped gently upon the mantelpiece, his fingers drumming in time with his thoughts. Do you recall, he asked, how the Countess recoiled when I mentioned the violin case? Vividly, I replied. Her composure broke for the briefest instant. Holmes nodded. It was not the case itself, but what it had carried, and what it still threatened to reveal. He took the photograph again and placed it beside the ciphered sheet. She knew both men, and more than knew them. She shared in their secrets. But with which did her loyalty lie? She trembled, I said, but said nothing. Precisely. Guilt has many voices, but the most dangerous of them is silence. I watched as he aligned the edge of the photograph with a second image, a press clipping from the Vienna inquiry into Radek's disappearance. Though grainy and incomplete, the resemblance was there. Holmes's expression did not change. She was the thread between them, the intermediary, perhaps even the cause, and now she remains the last living witness to a betrayal both personal and political. I shivered at the thought. Do you think she is in danger? Holmes did not look up. She is a part of the past that refuses to die. And so long as Radek lives, she is not only in danger, Watson, she is the reason for it. Holmes placed the photograph and the ciphered notes back into the envelope with unusual care, as though sealing a confession neither of us had yet spoken aloud. He stood at the window, his silhouette framed by the last failing light. "For days we have spoken of a shadow," he said softly, "a presence that follows, that observes, that directs without revealing itself." He turned to me. "But now the shadow has acquired weight, a name, a motive, a history shaped in silence." "Radek," I murmured. Holmes nodded. "And with him, something older than vengeance, a score waiting to be played to its bitter end." He set the envelope into the drawer and locked it. "There will be others who seek him," he said, "and others still who wish him not to be found. But we, Watson, have now seen the face behind the void." Outside, the fog began to press once more against the windows, and I sensed in Holmes's silence that our pursuit was no longer academic. It had become a reckoning, and it had only just begun. Holmes's arrangements for that evening were of a character both intricate and precise. By the time dusk had gathered over South Kensington, every seat within the Royal Albert Hall was filled, the chandeliers glittering above a sea of evening dress and anticipation. It was, ostensibly, a charity concert in honour of the Bohemian Relief Fund, an event of music and goodwill. Yet for us, it was something altogether different, a trap laid in the shape of civility. Holmes, ever inconspicuous in his dark frock coat, had secured a pair of seats near the eastern balcony, affording him an unobstructed view of the stage and the corridor leading behind it. "Our quarry," he murmured, "will not resist the call of his own creation." Inspector Lestrade, whom I glimpsed among the upper tiers, was accompanied by several plainclothes men dispersed through the audience. To the public eye, they were patrons of culture. In truth, they were sentinels awaiting a ghost. The hum of tuning strings rose to a delicate tremor, and Holmes's eyes sharpened. "It is time," he said quietly. "Let the music speak, and let those who have hidden behind it reveal themselves." The lights dimmed. The concert, and the reckoning, began. The opening strains drifted through the vast hall, a slow, mournful air that seemed to carry with it the echo of the Baron's final hours. Holmes sat utterly motionless, his eyes closed, his lips faintly parted, as if each note were a phrase he alone could decipher. I could feel it too, that strange, oppressive beauty that seized one's senses and pressed upon the chest like an invisible weight. When the melody reached its second movement, Holmes leaned slightly forward. "There," he whispered, almost to himself. "Hear it, Watson. A confession, not a composition." The violins rose in a trembling chorus, the same sequence of notes we had seen transcribed in cipher across the Baron's sheet. The connection was undeniable. The code had been born of this very piece. As the tempo quickened, the audience swayed unconsciously, but Holmes's gaze swept the balconies and aisles with predatory calm. Somewhere among the gilded shadows sat the one who had turned harmony into treachery. I sensed it then, the same tightening in the air I had known before disaster in battle. Holmes did not look at me, but I heard him murmur, "The shadow draws breath," and the music deepened. It was during the third movement that I caught sight of him. A tall man in immaculate evening dress rose quietly from a seat near the lower tier and slipped along the aisle. His bearing was erect, his pace deliberate, that of one accustomed to command. The faint gleam of a glove caught the gaslight as he disappeared toward the stage entrance. I turned to Holmes. He had seen it too. Without a word, he rose, adjusting his cuffs with the calm of a man stepping into inevitability. I followed close behind. The corridor behind the stage was narrow and dimly lit, the muffled sound of the orchestra filtering through the heavy curtains. The man had paused near the music stands, his head slightly bowed, one gloved hand brushing the stack of scores as though searching for something lost or hidden. Holmes's voice, low and unmistakable, broke the silence. "You play your part well, Colonel, but even the most disciplined musician must at last face the audience." The man turned. His face, pale and sharp, bore the lines of a life spent in command and deceit. For a heartbeat, The shadow we had pursued across cities and graves had at last taken human form. Holmes stepped forward, and for the first time I saw uncertainty flicker in the man's eyes. "Colonel Emmerich Radek," said Holmes evenly, "late of the Austrian Intelligence Corps, reported dead but never buried. Your ghost has travelled far to attend this performance." Radek smiled thinly, his composure returning. "You overestimate your knowledge, Mr. Holmes. I am no ghost." Holmes withdrew the folded photograph from his pocket and held it beneath the stage lamp. "The Baron, the Countess, and yourself, before a scandal that turned allies into conspirators." Radek's gaze hardened. Holmes continued, his tone almost clinical. "You erased your face from this image, but not from memory. The ciphered melody concealed your treaty. The violins string your signature of death. Baron Kroll died to preserve your secret, yet in killing him, you sealed it." The colonel's shoulders straightened. "He betrayed me first. I merely finished the phrase he began." At Holmes's signal, Lestrade emerged from the side door with 2 officers, revolvers drawn. Radek inclined his head in mock courtesy. "So it ends upon a stage. How fitting. Spies and detectives, each pretending at virtue." But even then, I sensed the man's defeat was not yet complete. "Confess," Radek said, his voice steady, almost indifferent. "Why should I confess to justice when I have served necessity?" Holmes regarded him in silence, the faint hum of the orchestra filtering through the curtains, the very piece that had unmasked its own author. Radek continued, his tone sharpening. "Yes, I killed Kroll. He had become sentimental, dangerous. Our little circle of musicians had long ceased to play only for applause. Beneath every performance, messages travelled between embassies, notes within notes. The Countess transcribed them, Kroll ferried them, and I composed them, until he lost his courage." "You murdered him," I said quietly. "I silenced a traitor," Radek replied. "He would have exposed a dozen agents, unravelled a network that held a continent together. Do you think your England is innocent of such artifice, Doctor?" Holmes's voice was calm, yet it cut like steel. "You mistake silence for order, Colonel. One cannot build peace upon the grave of a friend." Radek smiled faintly. "Peace is always built upon graves, Mr. Holmes. The only question is whose." At that moment, a rustle behind the curtain made him turn sharply. His gloved hand twitched toward his breast pocket. Holmes's eyes narrowed. He had seen it first. It happened in an instant. Radek's hand flashed upward, a glint of metal catching the lamplight. But before the shot could sound, Lestrade's revolver barked sharply, once, then twice. Radek staggered, the pistol clattering from his grip. He sank against the wall, his expression one of disbelief rather than pain. The orchestra beyond the curtain continued unbroken, the violins swelling in a haunting crescendo that seemed to accompany his fall. Holmes knelt beside him. "The melody ends, Colonel." Radek's lips moved, forming words no one could hear. Then his head fell to one side, the faintest trace of a smile upon it. Lestrade lowered his weapon with a sigh. "A clean shot, sir. It's over." Holmes rose slowly. "Nothing," he said, "is ever truly over. Some compositions simply fade, unresolved." The conductor brought the piece to its final chord, and as the applause broke like thunder through the hall, the curtain between stage and intrigue seemed to fall as well. I remember thinking, as the echoes died, that death had found a strange harmony with art that night, and that both had been of the same composer. The following evening found us once more in Baker Street. The air was still heavy with the residue of that night, smoke, memory, and something darker. Holmes stood before the hearth, the ciphered music spread upon the mantelpiece. Without hesitation, he struck a match and set the paper alight. The flames rose briefly, consuming the notes until nothing remained but curling ash. "Even shadows," he murmured, "deserve their burial." I watched in silence. "You pity him," I said at last. Holmes's gaze remained upon the embers. Pity. Perhaps. He played a dangerous game, and he played it well. But he mistook artifice for art, deception for intellect. That is the tragedy of men such as Radek. They orchestrate their own requiem. He turned to me then, his expression inscrutable. Justice was done, though not in the form the law would recognize. Do you find that troubling, Watson? I hesitated. It was necessary. Holmes smiled faintly. Then, let us call it balance. Outside a carriage passed, its wheels muffled by the mist. The clock ticked softly. In that stillness, I felt the case close not with triumph, but with something more solemn. The faint, enduring echo of guilt's final note. The morning following the tumultuous revelations at the Royal Albert Hall descended upon Baker Street with a stillness so profound that it seemed almost accusatory. The drizzle from the night's storm had ceased, leaving behind a pall of moisture on the panes and a muffled hush upon the streets below. I sat in my usual armchair, nursing a tepid cup of tea, uncertain whether it was the weight of fatigue or the burden of comprehension that pressed so heavily upon my chest. Holmes had not spoken since we returned before dawn. He now occupied the seat by the window, his tall, spare frame draped in his dressing gown, his chin resting lightly upon steepled fingers. The pipe between his lips sent forth slow, spectral curls of smoke that rose and twisted like reluctant phantoms, fading into the grey light. His gaze was fixed on some unseen point beyond the misted glass, not the street, I fancied, but something farther, more intangible. The fire crackled softly, unacknowledged. Even the coals seemed to respect the mood of that morning, burning low and red, as though unwilling to disturb the thoughts of the man before them. As the clock marked each minute with a sober tick, I found myself reflecting not merely upon the events of the previous night, but upon the nature of the crimes Holmes and I had faced through the years. Rarely had they been the product of sudden rage or heedless impulse. More often, they were born of silence, of things unsaid, concealed beneath the crust of daily life, festering like wounds denied air. It was not the thunderclap that caused the flood, but the silent, steady accumulation of rain. The case of Radek had been no exception. Behind the melodrama of espionage, of ciphers and concealed allegiances, there had been a silence, one so dense it might have drowned a lesser man. And now that silence had ended, not in words, but in a gunshot. Across from me, Holmes remained inert, yet his immobility carried its own eloquence. There was something unusually remote in his stillness, not the calm of conclusion, but the inertia of reflection. I had seen him in post-triumphal languor before, but this was different. It struck me, not for the first time, that even victory might carry the taste of ash, particularly when the truth revealed bore no comfort. At last, the hush became unbearable. The air between us had thickened with unasked questions, and though my instinct urged restraint, I felt compelled to pierce it. I leaned forward and said quietly, "Holmes, may I ask, now that Radek is gone and the pieces are laid bare, do you feel it has brought you satisfaction?" He did not stir, save to remove the pipe from his mouth. A long silence followed, punctuated only by the soft hiss of embers collapsing inward in the grate. His eyes did not turn to me, but remained fixed upon the dying coals. At length, he sighed. It was not one of weariness, but of something subtler, a sound born of the weight that accompanies knowledge one cannot discard. "Some cases, my dear Watson," he said at last, "do not end. They merely settle into silence." He replaced the pipe, and the conversation was closed. Yet the words lingered between us, heavier than the fog beyond the windows. I understood in that moment that the true mystery of the case might not lie in the clues uncovered, but in what remained unsaid. It was some time later, the fire nearly spent, the fog beginning to lift, when Holmes spoke again, his voice low, devoid of its usual steel. "There is a detail, Watson, which I omitted from my statement to Lestrade. This admission startled me, though I did not interrupt. He rarely withheld from the police unless the motive was grave and calculated. The Countess Novakova, he continued, was not merely Radek's contact. She was, in fact, his superior within the Prague circle. A strategist of no small talent, well placed in diplomatic society, her removal would send tremors through more than one consulate. I sat upright. But surely Lestrade must be told. She remains a danger. Holmes held up a hand. The Home Office has already been advised, quietly. Formal exposure, however, would do more harm than good. There are negotiations underway between her government and ours. Her arrest would rupture delicate balances that neither side is prepared to sacrifice. His eyes met mine then, grave and without apology. I make no claim to moral authority, Watson, only to reason, and reason dictated that I leave her name out of the report. He returned to the hearth, silent once more, leaving me to reckon with the cost of discretion. I could not remain silent. The very marrow in my bones rebelled against what I had just heard. "But Holmes," I said, rising to my feet, "you are aiding an evasion of justice. Radek may be dead, but the Countess lives and continues to manipulate the channels of power for purposes we cannot fully divine." Holmes remained unshaken, his back turned to me as he studied the remnants of the fire. "You mistake my silence for assent, Watson," he said quietly. "I do not condone her actions, but there are occasions when truth, like arsenic, must be administered with care. Too strong a dose, and it kills the very body it was meant to cure." I could find no immediate reply. The metaphor was grotesque, yet apt. My instinct for rightness warred with the implications of his reasoning. "Then where do we draw the line?" I asked, not without bitterness. "If we conceal one name, what prevents us from concealing another?" Holmes turned at last, his eyes soft, almost pitying. "That, my dear Watson, is why men like you must walk beside men like me, to ask precisely such questions, even when the answers do not please you." Holmes moved to the window and stood there for some time, hands clasped behind his back, watching as the morning fog thinned over the rooftops of London. When he finally spoke, it was not to justify, but to muse. "You see, Watson, we imagine that knowledge is a lamp, that it only illuminates, never burns. But I have found that too much daylight can bleach a soul as surely as darkness can stain it." He gestured toward the city beyond. "London thrives on such shadows. Every street, every whisper of Parliament or alley of Limehouse holds truths better left half hidden. To chase every spectre into the sun is to risk dismantling the very balance that holds society together." I approached slowly. "You mean to say some mysteries are best left unsolved?" "No," he said, turning toward me. "Only that some truths must remain veiled, not because they are unworthy, but because their unveiling would do more harm than their concealment." He smiled faintly, and for a moment I glimpsed a deep fatigue behind his eyes. Not physical, but moral. "There are shadows, my dear Watson," he murmured. "One must leave unexamined, lest daylight destroy more than it reveals." Holmes returned to his chair, and after a moment's adjustment, took up his violin. The bow moved softly across the strings, issuing a plaintive tune that seemed neither cheerful nor sorrowful, but simply resigned, the sound of something released rather than resolved. I stood at the window, watching as the last threads of fog dissolved into pale sunlight. Below, the world stirred to life again. Carriages passed, footsteps echoed. A newsboy shouted a headline no longer relevant to us. Yet I could not shake the sense that something within the flat had changed, not in furniture or arrangement, but in gravity. A truth had been buried, not forgotten. A woman remained free, not absolved. And in that moment, I understood. Not every mystery ends with justice. Some end only with silence. Holmes stood by the window, the violin cradled gently beneath his chin, though the bow had stilled. Outside, The fog thinned into pale strands above Baker Street, as if retreating from the light. He did not turn when he spoke. "There are truths, Watson," he said softly, "that do not demand revelation, only restraint. Radek sought power through chaos, and in doing so, became its prisoner. The Countess, though no innocent, chose silence not out of fear, but to preserve something greater than herself." I glanced at him, unsettled. "But surely, Holmes, justice—" He lowered the violin. "Justice, my dear fellow, is rarely pure. Like the fog, it is shaped by what it obscures." He let the silence stretch a moment longer, then returned to his chair and lit a fresh match for his pipe. The case was closed, and yet something deeper remained unfinished. Do you believe Holmes was right to protect the Countess's secret, or was that the gravest mistake of all? Let us know what you would have done in Holmes's place. Would you have chosen justice or diplomacy? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this mystery intrigued you, be sure to subscribe for more tales from Baker Street. And don't forget to pass the story along to fellow lovers of detective fiction. After all, some shadows are best shared.